Hey guys, what's up? It's Josh. Hope you're having a great night. I just wanted to make this video. It's been something that I've been talking about a lot on the ZCAM group, and everyone seems to be talking about RAW these days, RAW video. ZCAM currently offers two flavors, Z-RAW and ProRes RAW, and there's just a lot of chatter on the future of Z-RAW and if it's still relevant and how it compares to ProRes RAW, which can only be recorded externally. So what I wanted to do was shoot some clips and go through the different RAW codecs as well as the internal 10-bit codecs. And I just wanted to see if I could see a difference between them in my test and how they were different, what areas they were strong in and what areas they were weak in. So I've recorded these clips, and basically I have a normal exposure, and then I did an overexposure, and then an underexposure as well. And you guys just bear with me, my computer doesn't really love these super high res Z-RAW files and H.265 files. It's going to crawl a little bit. And then the other thing I said is when I did my overexposure test, a lot of times I was dropping my lens down to 1.8, so the focus is a little dicey on some of the overexposures, but you'll still, I think, be able to see the differences and all that kind of stuff. So let's just kind of jump in. This is our first set of clips, and this is H.265. This is a normal clip. Let's look at it at 200%, just to kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with. Very nice on the quality, the sharpness and detail. We got a little bit of grain here. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see it in YouTube, but nothing crazy. And this is the full 6K file, so I imagine if it was downscaled to 4K, you really wouldn't see it at all. And this looks great. If we go to the overexposure, and what we're going to basically do for all these clips, except for ProRes RAW and one of the versions of Z-RAW, you'll see what I mean. We're going to use the Z-Log color plugin, and I'm just using the default input color space of Z-Log 2, and the default is the ZRGB. We can change this to Rec 709, but to me it doesn't look any different. So I just left it on the default, and we're only going to use this exposure stops. So on this one, we're going to reduce it by 7, and that just pops back into place beautifully. Looks really good. Retained everything super well. If you go to 200%, you can just see the nice thing about doing it this way is you just eliminate pretty much all the grain. It's just so clean, especially on the F6 that this was shot on. So when people tell you to expose to the right, that's what they're talking about, because it just does. It gets rid of the grain. It's crazy. But if we go here to the under clip, we're going to look at this. We're going to do the same process, but we're going to add 6 here. And ooh, yuck. Let's go to 5 and see if that's better. What you can see here on the H.265 is that it gets kind of gross. It gets pretty grainy, and there's a green shift happening here in the shadows. It's pretty bad. If we go to 200%, you should be able to see all that grain, and it's just color grain. There's a lot of green in it. It's not the worst thing in the world. You could fix it with some noise reduction, but Z-Log 2 by nature doesn't like to be underexposed, and it looks the worst of all of the codecs when it's underexposed in H.265. So you'll see all this green cast that you won't see in the other codecs. But if we go to the ProRes here, you'll notice instantly that for whatever reason, the ProRes just seems to be more magenta than the H.265. I'll go back to the H.265 here, and you'll see it once it loads. It's just greener. It's greener. It's a little bit less magenta. I'm not sure why that is. I've found that the ProRes and the Z-RAW kind of have the same. And if that happens with the green screen, I'll just bear with me. It's just my computer trying to load these Z-RAW files with the proxies off. But the colors are real similar on the ProRes and the Z-RAW. So if you're shooting either one of those, you can kind of go back and forth between those without a tint adjustment. But if you're going to shoot The H.265, you may end up wanting to adjust your tint a little bit. But if you look at the ProRes here, and if we zoom into 200%, it's very clean. There's a little bit of grain there, nothing bad. I feel like this is just a tad bit sharper than the H.265. Not too bad, but that seems a little bit softer. And the ProRes here, it seems a little bit crispier. And if we go to the over, we're going to do the same process. We're going to bring it down by 7. And that looks really nice, really clean. It retained everything that we had lost. And you'll notice here, I mean, my focus is a little off, but the grain is just, it's so clean when you do it that way. It definitely like a good argument to work to use that exposing to the right technique to get really clean images. But that ProRes looks great. Let's go here to the under, and we're gonna boost this by 5. And kind of similar to the H.265, there's definitely some grain that's coming from this. As we said earlier, Z-Log 2 doesn't like to be underexposed. It just doesn't do well with that. So right here, you know, you've got a decent amount of grain, but one thing you will notice is that it retains its black color where it's totally green on the H.265. So going back, you know, it doesn't really mess with the color, although it adds the grain. The color holds pretty well, and it probably could be saved with some reduction, some noise reduction. But the way I'm doing the Z-Raws in this example is I'm going to have the first 3 where I'm going to use the color plugin to adjust it, and then these ones are duplicates, and I'm going to actually use the master settings to adjust it, and we're going to see if it looks any different. So the first one here is just the Z-Raw normal, and let's go to 200%. About the same amount of grain, maybe a little bit more than the ProRes, but that comes to be expected with RAW. It's just a little bit noisier in general. The detail looks pretty good. One thing I'll say to Kinson and any ZCAM person, if you're watching this, for whatever reason, when you import these Z-Raw files into Premiere, they come in with upper field first, and like almost like it's interlaced, even though they're not, and it's really strange, honestly. Let me see if it'll show it here. It's not in there, but I can go into here, and you know, it comes in as upper field first for some reason. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I've conformed it here to progressive. It helps it to look a lot better. So if you're using Premiere, you can either do that in Premiere, you can do it in Resolve if you send out something for grading, but you do need to change it to progressive. I don't see like all these interlacing lines like a traditional interlaced codec, but for whatever reason, if that seems like it shouldn't be doing that, it seems like it should just be staying progressive. So if ZCAM, if you think that's a bug or it's something you can fix, that would be awesome, because it's only causing problems in my opinion, as far as working with this Z-Raw. But this looks great. If you go to the over and we do that, like I said, this Z-Raw file, I've got the proxies turned off, so it is very intensive. But we'll do the same process here, and we'll go down by 7, and that just pops back very nicely. No issues there whatsoever. And you can tell here that the grain is super duper clean on here as well. A little bit more probably than the ProRes just from being raw, but the detail is really good and it just looks awesome. We'll go here to the under, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a 5, and just like the ProRes, it's pretty grainy, pretty noisy. Some definite color noise in there. I don't know how well you can see that on YouTube. More color noise than the ProRes for sure. The ProRes, the grain's a little bit finer and there's not as much color in it. The Z-Raw here is definitely noisier, and it's got more color noise to it. And let's look and see if we go through this the opposite way, and instead of using the plugin to adjust it, we use the master settings. So you can come in here and you can change the ISO. We're going to drop it down to 1000. And let's zoom back in. Honestly, I think that doing it that way produced a little bit cleaner of a result here. There seems to be a little bit less grain using it that way than adjusting with the plugin. And then let's go here to the under. And we'll do the same thing, except we're going to go up. And to me, I think doing it that way for this is even worse than using the ZCAM color plugin, because it seems to have more of a magenta shift. That seems a little bit more normal. And then this one really shifts magenta. We can actually probably bring this down a little bit. It seems a little bright. Let's try 2000, maybe 2500. Yeah, so let's now compare these two. They're pretty similar, but it does seem like it adds a little bit of more of a cast doing it this way. But let's look at the noise. Same type of color noise. It's better than the H.265. It doesn't shift so green. Let me get back to. But it is very, very noisy. And the takeaway here that you need to know is just like, on these ZCAMs, they're in Z-Log 2 profile. They don't like to be underexposed at all. It's going to result in noise if you underexpose, no matter what codec you're in. Whether you're shooting H.265 Z-RAW or ProRes, you still have to expose your shot properly. And these cameras look the best when you expose to the right at least one stop. So don't think, oh, it's just because it's RAW, I can save it in post and it's going to look great. That's not how it works. These ZCAMs use an analog gain where they're adding more voltage to the sensor for every ISO. So when you adjust the ISO in post, you're not adding more voltage to a camera. You're just digitally adding exposure or taking it away with these master settings. So it's not going to solve your problem. If you underexpose, it's going to have grain. That being said, let's move to the ProRes RAW, because it's a lot different than these other codecs, because the ProRes RAW is a linear codec, and this is similar to Camera RAW, but it's kind of got its own little color thing going on. And if you go here into the master settings, you can see that its color space is put it in 709, but it's interesting because it's not quite as flat as Z-Log 2 by itself, and it's not quite as contrasted as when you put the conversion, ZCAM color plugin on the other codecs. So it's kind of like right in the middle. It's got its own color thing, and I haven't been using the Z-Log or the ZCAM color plugin with it because the input color space is kind of strange and it doesn't quite work the way I want it to. So maybe there's a better way to do that. I've just been using the settings in here, and so it's not going to be as contrasted. But if you go ahead and you zoom in here to 200, I think we're dealing with less grain than the Z-RAW. Let me go back over here. Yeah. You can look here at the Z-RAW and see if it has any more. Yeah, the Z-RAW is more contrasted, but it also has a little bit more grain. And this ProRes one is very clean. I don't know if there's anything happening there, but it definitely doesn't stick out as much. Maybe it would if you added more contrast, but personally, I just think the sharpness and the detail of this ProRes RAW file just, to me, kind of blows away everything else we've looked at so far. I mean, if you go back to the Z-RAW, it still looks good, but it just isn't as sharp and clean looking as this ProRes RAW, which is just really sharp and clean and looks really great. Let's go here to the over and we'll zoom back out. For whatever reason, even at the same exposure settings, with this color space selected, this same setting just looks way blown out on the ProRes RAW, but it's really easy to just bring it down here and it brings everything back. Nothing's clipping, no issues there. So that does a really good job. And if you zoom in to 200%, I mean, this is the cleanest probably we've seen out of the RAW for sure. It's just super duper clean and very, very nice looking image out of the ProRes RAW there. Oops, I went back to H.265. Sorry about that. And then this is the under in the ProRes RAW. And we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to add it this time. And what we're seeing here is kind of similar to what we saw with the Z-RAW. I think it even has more of a magenta, kind of purpley cast than the Z-RAW did. Yeah, see, that's a little bit more natural. Even though there's more grain there, this ProRes RAW is just kind of giving it this a little bit of a magenta cast to it. And let's go ahead and zoom in. And it's kind of got that same color garbage noise that the Z-RAW had. So it's just more of the same. You can't get away with underexposing these images this much, no matter what codec you're in. But one thing to note that's kind of cool about, let me change this back because now it's way over, is you can adjust it that way, but because it's linear, it's also working well just using the Lumetri plug-in here. So, you know, you can just bring it back like that and grade it, you know, just using the Lumetri panel, and it keeps the linearity of the codec, which is pretty cool. So, because I know sometimes when you have to mess with the actual settings on the master tab here, it's kind of annoying because if you have a clip where you shot multiple clips from one file and you go in and you adjust the settings, it's going to adjust them globally for everything. So it does a really nice job of using Premiere's internal settings to be able to adjust that. And so if you look at something like this and the underexposed part, it's kind of interesting. Let's just see if we get kind of the same result as we did when we used the exposure option. Yeah, to me that looks exactly the same as before. So either way, you can't really underexpose these files, and so it's kind of hard to say. I would say, like, to me, the ProRes RAW, just when it's exposed correctly or overexposed, just seems to have the best looking like clarity to the image when compared to the other ones. I mean, the Z-RAW is really good as well. Hang on, let me see if I can get it to load here. And they're both great. They both look really nice. But something about that ProRes RAW, it just kind of pops. It's nice. But I don't think you can really go wrong with either of them. Both of them tend to have really, really good highlight recovery and just abysmal shadow recovery. So I think either one you look at, you know, that's going to be the case. But one thing I did want to do before I shut this down is just kind of mess around a little bit with color. It's kind of hard to tell in this setting, you know, how much of the 12-bit, if that's making much of a difference or anything like that. I just wanted to come in here and just kind of like screw with these files pretty hardcore. You know, you kind of crank it here. And one thing I've just noticed, I do think there's more color, like more of a spectrum of color in the 12-bit, but I've been also like very impressed with how well all of these codecs hold and shift color. I mean, that's a pretty drastic, you know, change or whatever, and it is doing a really nice job just holding the color. And let's go here, do the same thing on this ProRes file and see if we notice any difference between the two. These are both 10-bit codecs, but of course the ProRes is a 422 instead of a 420. To me, you know, I think when you look at this one versus the ProRes just seems to have a little bit more range of the green. It kind of gets to the green a little bit quicker on the H.265. and it's a little bit more saturated, where you have a little bit more of a tonal range on the ProRes here. If we throw this onto the Z-Raw, let's just see what happens, because this is a 12-bit codec. And one thing to know, if you're looking at these in your timeline in Premiere and you think it looks weird or it's banning or doing something strange, chances are you need to go up in your sequence settings and click on this maximum bit depth, and that will display it without the banding. But the color of the Z-Raw here to me is really nice. It seems like it's holding it really well. There's no intensity of the green like it was on the H.265. It's just kind of like, you know, it's smooth, but it doesn't really look all that different than the ProRes. So I think the ProRes is doing some nice work there as well. Let's look at this on the ProRes RAW. Yeah, so I mean, I know this isn't quite as contrasted as this other one. Let's go ahead and just add some to see if we can get it a more fair comparison. But check that out versus like the Z-Raw. Wait, that's not the right Z-Raw, sorry about that. This is the Z-Raw we added it to. You know, that's looking good. And then look at the difference. It's like kind of like a totally different color. You've got way more green, saturated, kind of funky looking skin in the ProRes RAW. You know, so that could be like a workflow thing, but to me, just like working right here in Premiere and doing this crazy color addition to this, I feel like the Z-Raw just kind of has the smoothest, like nicest look there. But it is interesting in the ProRes RAW how these back panels right here are totally blue, whereas you go, you know, here and it's kind of like more green and a different color. So, you know, I think there's definitely, I don't know if it's the linear nature of ProRes RAW, but there's definitely some question marks that I have just from like looking at how those two are different. You know, I think the downside at this point to ProRes RAW is just that you need a Ninja and it's external, which doesn't always inspire the best confidence as far as your recording media goes and recording that way. But I think both of these RAW codecs are really fantastic, and I think that the H.265 and the ProRes are really good as long as you don't underexpose them too bad. And honestly, the ProRes here on the underexposure is probably the best out of all of them as far as giving a suitable image that's not just crazy full of color noise, which you wouldn't really expect that, but that's the way that it is. It definitely has the best shadow recovery of all the codecs, even as a 10-bit codec. So, you know, I think you just have to expose all of these codecs correctly and not super underexpose them. And I think any of them are going to give you a pretty great result. I would imagine some of these other 12-bit codecs like the Z-Raw, when you bring into Resolve, you know, they typically tend to handle color differently. You have a little bit more of a range of color and just like a smoother palette when you're grading with the 12-bit. And then also, you know, when you're pulling color keys, they work a lot better on the 12-bit. So I think that's a great reason to shoot Z-Raw or ProRes RAW. But for now, I think this has been just an interesting thing for me to do and just to kind of see how they all respond. And I'm gonna do some more of this where I just really test the full range. I want to take, you know, ProRes RAW and Z-Raw outside during sunlight and golden hour and just really see how much they retain. But I think it's kind of exciting to be able to use all these and have a pretty reasonable path through Media Encoder to convert it all and use it in Resolve. Anyway, hope this was helpful and insightful to you guys, and I will look forward to the next video.